and welcome to the show. This is Diplomatic Insight from Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation with me, Gzacho Dir. Our guest for today is the Secretary General of Organization of Southern Cooperation, His Excellency Mansour bin Musallam. According to scholars, the dichotomy of global north and global south is not a rhetoric. It is a reality. It is a manifestation of charity and the recipient, growth and poverty trap, as well as developed and developing nations. As the depletion of natural resources and population growth becomes a worsening situation, leaders of countries of global south cannot afford taking the back seat. To transcend the legacy of double standard and empty promise, they took initiative to stand together in solidarity and formed Organization of Educational Cooperation, OEC, in 2020. After 3 years, by the end of June this year, leaders from African, Caribbean, Asian, Latin America, Pacific Island, and Middle Eastern countries, or the Arab world, come together here in Addis Ababa, and they formed an Organization of Southern Cooperation, which changed the name OEC into OSCE. Why is that? What's the motive behind? Is it a change of names or a change of strategy? Much emphasis was given for solidarity. Is it an opportunistic choice or an unavoidable necessity? Do stay with us. Secretary General of Organization of Southern Cooperation, Your Excellency Mansour bin Musallam, thank you for your time and welcome to Diplomatic Insight.
Thank you for the welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, Gzacho.
The Organization of Southern Cooperation has concluded just last month here in Addis Ababa. What are the highlights, the main points that were covered?
Here in Addis, in June of 2023, we held our first extraordinary session of the General Assembly, which was a General Assembly of particular importance. Particular importance because it marked the first in-person meeting of our ministers and our heads of state and government since COVID-19. As you're aware, the OSCE was founded in January of 2020, and shortly thereafter, as we celebrated the creation of this new instrument of countries of the global south, COVID-19 occurred and, of course, prohibited in-person meetings. And therefore, it marked the first in-person meeting of our member states at the level of their ministers and their heads of state and government since our founding summit. But most importantly, in terms of substance, the General Assembly approved during its session 3 major decisions. The first was, of course, validating the headquarters agreement that we had signed on the 3rd of November 2022 with the government of Ethiopia, establishing the Organization of Southern Cooperation's headquarters here in Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa, that has been historically known, as you're aware, of course, as the diplomatic hub and the diplomatic capital of Africa. And by validating this headquarters agreement here in Addis, recognizing not only the desirable nature of Addis in terms of the discharge of our mandate, but also the generous provisions and facilities provided by the government of the host country to the organization, the General Assembly, in approving this headquarters agreement, also made, I believe, Addis Ababa, in addition to being the diplomatic capital of Africa, also made it into the capital of Southern integration. And the second, important decision that was taken was the name itself. As you're aware, the organization was founded as the Organization of Educational Cooperation. Nevertheless, during the General Assembly, the member states came to the conclusion, the visionary conclusion, that the mandate of the organization is extremely broad, and it is fundamentally the organization, the intergovernmental organization of the South, by the South, for humanity. And therefore they decided to rename our organization in order to align its name to its mandate as the Organization of Southern Cooperation. And finally, one of the major decisions that were taken was the election of President Ghazali Uthmani of Comoros as the first president of the General Assembly, who will hold office until the next ordinary session that is scheduled for November 2024. They met with an understanding that education is central. There is no development without education. Yet, to speak of education for the sake of education, to speak of educational transformations for the sake of educational transformations, or even of educational reforms for the sake of educational reforms, is a futile, intellectual, abstract exercise. Because education is only meaningful when it serves a vision of the future, of where do we want to be as societies, as regions, as humanity in 20 years from now. And therefore, before speaking of the education that we need, we must be able to articulate the vision of the future that we want. And in this regard, our founding states from across the global south, from Latin America and the Caribbean, from Africa, from the Arab world and Asia Pacific, had this visionary quality of recognizing within our constitutive charter the importance not only of transforming our education systems towards what we call balanced and inclusivity, but also that in order to achieve our vision of the future, it was necessary for this organization, as the first intergovernmental organization of the South, to speak of three other crucial sectors: reinforcing transdisciplinary research capacities. Now, you might ask, before I mention the two others, what is transdisciplinary research and why is it important? As COVID-19 demonstrated, our countries must, first and foremost, strengthen our scientific research and production capacities, because we cannot depend, in times of crises in particular, on the goodwill of others. But also recognizing that our countries of the South have entire domains of knowledge that are extremely rich, extremely fruitful, but that have historically been delegitimized and marginalized. And that is our endogenous knowledge, our ancestral knowledge, our traditional knowledge. And therefore reinforcing transdisciplinary research capacities by renewing dialogue between academic and non-academic knowledge domains in order to conduct research that is responsive to the needs of our countries. The third of the mandates, including, of course, balanced and inclusive education as the first, is that of developing endogenous technologies. As demonstrated by COVID-19, but of course being a reality preceding COVID-19, which only exacerbated the problem, our countries face, Gesetru, a historic injustice. And that injustice is the persisting techno-digital divide between the North and the South, but also within countries of the South, between the urban and the rural areas. And of course, the solutions that have been provided to us until now, as countries of the South, are solutions that we welcome, but we also recognize that they are short-term solutions. These solutions consist either in donations of technology, for which we are grateful, and inviting us to purchase technologies and import them into our countries. Yet, what we recognize fundamentally is that these are short-term solutions that will not bridge the techno-digital divide. And they will not bridge the techno-digital divide for a very simple reason. With the exponential development of technologies that we know today, those technologies that we have received as donations, or those technologies that we will have purchased on a most costly basis, and that often are proprietary, closed source, that is, they cannot be adapted or built upon, these technologies in 3, 4, 5 years from now will be absolutely and utterly obsolete. And we will find ourselves in exactly the same situation we currently find ourselves in. And therefore, in parallel to these short-term solutions, the member states, when they created the Organization of Southern Cooperation, at the time educational cooperation that became Southern Cooperation, recognized fundamentally that we needed to invest collectively in developing our own endogenous technologies. And when I say endogenous, this can be local, national, or indeed regional, by harnessing the creative capacity and power of our youth and stimulating our economies so that our countries can become, first and foremost, drivers of the fourth industrial revolution instead of remaining what we currently are, which is mere passengers. And finally, the fourth mandate of the organization is accompanying our member states in, put simply, transforming the international financial architecture. And of course, this fourth mandate is absolutely crucial for two reasons. First, and this has become a topic in the international discourse since COVID-19, yet it was present in our charter prior to that, and that is that our countries must achieve a certain level of debt relief. Debt relief, not because we do not want to honor commitments. Our objective is to work with our creditors to find a solution that is agreeable to them as well. But debt relief because we need, as countries, the necessary fiscal space to invest where it matters, in our education systems, in our health systems, in our infrastructure, in our technological development. But we also know that debt relief alone is futile, because day of debt relief plus one, day of debt relief plus one, our countries will need new financing. And if that new financing comes with the same onerous terms, with the same conditionalities, the same interest rates as the financing that led us to our debt situation that instigated us to seek debt relief, then our collective efforts will have been for naught. And in this regard, the second aspect of this fourth mandate is working with the member states as a collective of countries from across the global south to secure fresh financing that is more favorable, highly concessional, and that enables us to invest in our multidimensional development agenda. And in this regard, our focus at the organization given by the member states is on 6 strategic sectors for that investment with the new financing that we need. And I speak of strategic sectors because we must, as countries, address the structural weaknesses within our economies that generate our dependencies. I'll give you a very quick example, Gazacho, if you'll allow me. Often, our countries of the South are invited to undertake policies that focus as an engine of economic development on tourism. And whereas we have no issue with tourism when well regulated, when respectful of the environment, when undertaking as well a tourism that is culturally sensitive, whereas we have no issue with that tourism. As an economic policy, tourism in countries such as ours, that are, more often than not, countries that have not yet achieved energy sovereignty, countries that have not yet achieved food sovereignty, countries that have not yet achieved high value-added industrialization, what receiving a mass of tourists ultimately means for our economies is that we will need to import more fuel in order to heat our hotels or cool down our hotels. We will need to import more food that we do not grow in order to service that tourism, and we will need to import more cars that we do not produce. And therefore what we receive on the one hand from that tourism goes out with the other. Some studies show that almost, it depends of course on the country and the kind of tourism, but some studies show that, for example, in the Caribbean, many countries, for every dollar that they receive from tourism, 70 cents go out in importations for that same tourism. And therefore, it generates this cycle of greater and greater dependency that prohibits development. And therefore, we speak of 6 strategic sectors of investment that are not exclusive, but that are strategic, that are sovereignty enhancing. What do I mean by sovereignty enhancing? When I speak of sovereignty, it is not necessarily national. It can be sub-regional, continental, but nevertheless, that ensures that self-sufficiency that is needed to answer the aspirations of our people for development. And those 6 strategic sectors are balanced and inclusive education systems, for reasons that are, of course, self-explanatory. Integral health systems, the need of which was demonstrated by the latest pandemic that may not be the last. In sustainable agriculture, in order to attain food sovereignty. And, of course, as I mentioned earlier, endogenous technology development, so that we become drivers, shapers of the 4th Industrial Revolution, of infrastructure. Because as an organization of the South, we believe that our countries will not develop without effective South-South cooperation. But at the same time, we also recognize that there is no possibility for effective South-South cooperation without authentic regional integration, whether it be African, Latin American, Southeast Asian. And there is no integration without the infrastructure for the integration, just as there is no development without the infrastructure for that development. Of course, following that, we fundamentally believe in the need to invest in high value added industrialization. Now, regarding this last point, allow me to exemplify. Because our countries remain until now, in their majority, exporters of low value added content, if not raw material, without transformation. You know, Gazzacho, I fundamentally believe, it is one of my many theories, that coffee is the greatest symbol of the South, because it is the only plant whose fruit is universal, yet that only grows in the South, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Arab world in some regions, and in Asia. It also is fundamentally a plant that exemplifies the structural injustices that our countries have suffered, but can also embody our aspirations for development. So I will give you a very simple example on the basis of coffee. I recently undertook, a few months back, several visits to member states at the level of heads of state. And of course I will not mention which country specifically or which head of state, but the truth is it's not the fault of that country or that government. It is a reality across our countries. And when I arrived in that country and went to the presidential palace to meet with the head of state, I was asked whether I would like some coffee. And of course, as I often say, I am, when it comes to coffee, weak. I do not know how to refuse coffee. And in this regard, I, of course, acquiesced. And when they brought me the coffee, now bear in mind, that country is one of the largest producers of coffee in the world. I was brought a cup with hot water, and a small jar of Nescafe. Now, what does that mean? That means that this country exported green beans to a country that does not produce coffee, had the green beans roasted, processed, and added in a jar, and sold back to that very same country. Now, our view, and this is why we speak of high value added industrialization, on the basis, of course, of sustainable development as well. It is not enough to produce in our countries. We must transform in our countries. And in fact, taking still the example of coffee, we must make investments in coffee-producing countries to create local markets in coffee roasting, processing, perhaps encapsulating plants, right? Which ultimately means that we also need to transform our education system, our technical and vocational education and training, in order to prepare our youth to lead that nascent sector. And of course, by producing it, transforming it in our countries, not only is it value added, but it is also far more sustainable. And as well, it generates, because it is more economical, a local market, a regional market, and who knows, perhaps an international market for our coffee. Now, similarly, when you start producing coffee, and this is our vision as an organization, and you start producing coffee, roasting it, processing it, and if you want to encapsulate it, often you will need materials such as aluminium for the coffee capsules. And your neighbor might be capable to produce aluminium. And therefore, as an organization, we believe that we must invest in that high value added industrialization, but also think in a systemic manner. We cannot speak of economic development without speaking of agriculture, without speaking of education, without speaking of health. And also, with that systemic approach to our development, we must also think beyond nationally, where sometimes, as a sub-region, as a region, and as the South, we have the capacity of completing our endeavors, and therefore collectively strengthening our aspiration for development. And this is really the role of the OSCE. And it is, to answer your question, just to answer your question, and this is why the member states deemed it necessary to align the name of the organization to its mandate, so that it really reflects the very broad scope of the cooperation that falls under the OSCE, but also to be very clear that just as we need continental organizations or regional organizations, just as we need global organizations such as the United Nations, which are absolutely crucial, we also need organizations that bring the South together, that are countries that are extremely diverse in their histories and realities, but that share some systemic challenges and common aspirations.
Despite techno-digital barriers and also international financial architecture, even in terms of date 2, we can also push it to that extent. What's the vision of OSCE, the Organization of Southern Cooperation, to make it unique from OEC2?
Many models have been proposed to us as countries of the South. Yet, in the age of climate change, that is a certainty and not a theory only, in which we know that if I could, by the wave of a magic wand, make every single person live as the average Swiss, live as the average Frenchman, live as the average American or US Americans, the planet would not sustain it. The world would end. The world would end. And as a question of a minute, I think one of the studies that I read dates now, I'm sure it's worse, that if just taking not even the United States, taking the average Texan. If everybody lived like the average Texan, we would need 11 planets. So therefore, clearly, the models of the development that have been utilized and promoted in the North are not desirable because they're unsustainable. And therefore, our view is, one of the terms we used to be called as the global south, as the third world, which is a term that I do not reject, because in my view, third world does not mean that there is a first world, a second world, and we're number 3. No. What it means is that in this era, in this moment of history, from what was once the third world, by what was once the third world, we have the historic responsibility for the entirety of humanity to build a third way of development. And therefore, if you were to ask me, as a summary, the vision of the OSCE, understood not as the Secretariat, but understood as a collective of countries, institutions, and individuals from across the South, from across what was once the third world. I would tell you that our vision is very clear. The collective construction of a third, alternative, and inclusive way of development from the South, by the South, but for the entirety of humanity.
Why Ethiopia was chosen as a headquarter for OSCE?
When the first General Assembly met, one of the major topics was the establishment of the headquarters. And the General Assembly invited countries, both members and non-members, to express their interest in hosting the international headquarters of our collective organization, and asked the Secretary General to engage with those countries in order to determine on a certain set of criteria where to establish the headquarters. And of course, Ethiopia was, and I say that since it is public information, the first country to express firm interest in hosting the headquarters of the South. And of course, that in and of itself is a great demonstration of the commitment of Ethiopia as a country, as a founding state of the organization, to our common vision and to our common objectives as countries. Yet, alone it would have been insufficient to justify hosting the headquarters. So I enter into the second layer of why Ethiopia was chosen. First is the fact that as an intergovernmental organization, especially an intergovernmental organization that covers 4 large regions, that covers 3 continents, it was particularly important for us as a collective to ensure that our member states could access the headquarters with relative ease, and that the staff members and officials of the organization could also visit the member states with relative ease. And therefore, air accessibility, or accessibility by air travel, was crucial. And it is no secret that Ethiopia, and Addis Ababa in particular, is a hub when it comes to airlines, especially with the presence of Ethiopian Airlines. So this was one reason. The second reason is, as an intergovernmental organization, as a multilateral endeavor that requires proactive diplomatic engagement, it seemed particularly important to ensure a high level of diplomatic representation in the city hosting the organization to facilitate the necessary coordination and engagement between the Secretariat and our member states and other states as well. And of course, as you know, Ethiopia and Addis Ababa is the 3rd diplomatic hub after New York and Geneva. And finally, infrastructure. Infrastructure in the sense that the organization generally organizes its General Assembly at its headquarters. where we expect high-level representation in the ordinary session of our heads of state and government, as well as very large ministerial delegations. And it was important to ensure that the city hosting the headquarters had the necessary infrastructure in order to host all those heads of state. Because, you know, with time, the Organization of Southern Cooperation can reach a maximum of approximately 120 countries, given the geographic scope. And what was particularly important was to ensure that the host city could receive an initiative in such events. And finally, the third layer is, I would argue, symbolic. Symbolism, you know, is very important. You know, because symbols are what make matters sacred. Not necessarily religious, but sacred. And sacredness or sacrality is what builds collectives. What is sacred, sacrality, is what makes sacrilege prohibited, but also that justifies sacrifice. And in this regard, symbolism is central to any endeavor, especially an endeavor that seeks to achieve the aspirations for development of our countries. And when we speak of our countries, what are we speaking about? We are speaking of peoples, of individuals, of communities, of families, of the average citizen that wants to remain in his or her country and contribute to the betterment of the entirety of society. And therefore, for such a noble endeavor, symbols are important. And as I said before, Addis has been known as the diplomatic capital of Africa, but better said, the capital of African integration. And I think that symbolically, this effort of solidarity is one that needed to be recognized by stating as well that Addis, representing this African integration, could and perhaps should represent this integration of our countries of the South.
During the General Assembly's session, multilateralism was the main issue for the discussion. Yes. How do you see the current multilateral system?